The role of disciplines is to give us a kind of a common language with which, and a common toolkit, and a common corpus of materials to work on using the language and the toolkit, so that we can remain oriented to one another. Now, exactly the same things that I worry about with the social media can happen inside the disciplines, so that everybody ends up talking to each other, they end up talking to people from other disciplines, maybe they marginalize people who are trying to enact their discipline in a different way. The disciplines are themselves kind of new as institutional forms. I mean, so some of these things, as I've already said, go back thousands of years, and they were loosely disciplinarized. I suppose there was actually institutional apparatus associated with the practice of philosophy, even in ancient Greece. But the disciplines as fully institutionalized forms that have, say, university departments, that have learned journals, that have academic publishers publishing, a series of books in the various disciplines, that have the kind of whole system of peer review that superintends the publication of academic research. That's a kind of a 19th century phenomenon.
I would avoid putting the three into discrete silos, but instead I would prefer to see them as existing on a continuum or a spectrum. And I see the social sciences as nicely positioned in the middle, and I think they do provide a kind of in between the two. And I see these differences maybe first in terms of traditions. So there are research traditions in terms of ways of doing research and ways of presenting research that are very concrete within the sciences, and this produces expectations about how it is a reader will engage with different published works, as well as research processes. Whereas within the humanities, you might not have a methods section, whereas in the social sciences, most often you'll have a methods section, but it's going to look very different to what you'll have in the sciences. So those research and writing traditions can be very different. Also, big differences on the extent to which subjectivity is acknowledged. So, of course, everyone's an N within the sciences, whereas within the social sciences, that happens sometimes. But there is especially work that's more on the humanities kind of side of the social sciences. There's an acknowledgement of the importance of positionality and the importance of reflexivity, turning that observer lens, the researcher lens, back onto yourself to understand how you are part of the research process and a tool that's central to the research itself. So there's more of a tradition of acknowledging subjectivity. And in terms of the humanities, I won't speak too much on that front because I don't see myself as an expert, but instead, from my position, I see the humanities as providing a really valuable springboard for my own research when I ask questions about what might be different about emotions in this contemporary era that we call late modernity. Well, to consider that, I need to ask, well, what were emotions like in history? So the intersections are clear, and I see the social sciences as a nice bridge between these two really important driving forces in everyday life.
With respect to studies in religion, it's always been construed as a discipline which crosses over from the humanities to the social sciences, because it is, on the one hand, multi-religious, it's pluralistic, and the study of religion is, on the other hand, multidisciplinary. I'm not sure how studies in religion would position itself with respect to the sciences. I mean, there is a sense in which one of the key moments in the study of religion in the West is, of course, the origins of modern science and the way in which religion is inflected differently in the West as a consequence of the rise of science, and many people, at least until very recent times, would have believed it to be the case that to be scientific is in conflict with what it is to be religious. And one of the key problems within the study of religion in the modern West goes to whether you can be both religious and scientific, or are the two always incompatible or in conflict with one another. I think it's probably the case that those in studies in religion, by virtue of the fact that they try to remain with respect to religion neutral to issues of truth, wouldn't see themselves as in conflict with the STEM disciplines or the physical or biological sciences. You know, in the German context, the study of religion is Religionswissenschaft, it's religious science, it's the scientific study of religion. So in that sense, you know, those of us in the tradition wouldn't see ourselves as in the business of doing something that's in conflict with the sciences, but quite compatible with them.
I think in the field of environmental sociology, which has only been around really as a distinct discipline for a couple of decades, it grew out of a rural sociological tradition, and many who moved into rural sociology had agricultural science and related training backgrounds. So yes, I do think that that many people who work in the environmental and related rural sociological space do have some kind of training in the biological or the agricultural sciences, for example. But I think the discipline of sociology more broadly is a broad church, and people come from all sorts of different backgrounds, social welfare, community development, geography. And having said that, I'm also of the view that there's not a really tight boundary between anthropology, for example, and sociology and human geography. I think that particularly in the kinds of worlds that we live in now, the so-called narratives we hear about wicked problems, climate change, growing global inequality and such, that the distinction or the significance of making a distinction between these disciplines is less and less important. I think it's important to acknowledge the historical traditions and the historical backgrounds that these disciplines have come from, but I think that there is much blurring of the boundaries of these disciplines that goes on, and I think there's a real richness in that nexus between those spaces where we can think through some of these kinds of challenges that we face, that this generation will go on to work in those spaces in years to come.
Criminology is one of those things, actually it's probably more than a discipline, it's more like a field. And it is cross-cutting across a number of social sciences, even humanities. And the thing that kind of gathers all of these different multiple perspectives together is the one thing that we all in some way are concerned with, I guess, what causes crime and what we do about it. So that's kind of a very social process. So what crime is and what we decide at any given point to define as crime and how we decide to punish people, that's a very social process. So as a result, we kind of side heavily on more social sciences, sociology, psychology, also law, but also the humanities, so philosophy. So what is it that that we can count as crime? What ought we, what should we punish and why? And you know, how does that change over time? How does that change across societies, that kind of thing?
I taught in Fiji last year at the University of South Pacific, and I was teaching in a context in the social sciences department there. So I was teaching sociology, anthropology students and also history students. And there was one interesting moment where the history students were being told by one of my colleagues who worked in sociology and anthropology that they should de-identify all of the actors in their writing. And so myself and other historians started getting essays from one particular student, graduate student, in which they'd changed all the names of the towns and people that they were writing about in their history essay. And of course, this is quite normal within anthropology and sociology, where you want to protect your sources. But in history, it's problematic if you can't even say which country the person's writing about. And I think it really highlights just how differently sources get treated in different areas. In anthropology, there's a personal relationship with the sources, and it's contemporary. For historians, and I should add for the anthropologists, there's a sense in which the encounter happens once and once only. So there's a lot of trust built up in the personality of the anthropologist to record their encounter and interaction with the people they're studying. In history, it's quite different, where often the people have passed, or certainly the events have happened usually some time ago and are less pertinent and controversial. But on top of that, there's a sense in which historians want other historians to be able to go back and recheck those sources and perhaps write different histories about the same events. So the very idea of what an event is and one's relationship to those sources is profoundly different between anthropology and history, for instance.
Debates around, I'm not an expert in this, but certainly what ideas of artificial intelligence and robots and robot ethics, and can machines learn themselves, and at what point will the machines make their own decisions? These are quite big questions. Will like a self-driving car, for instance, how do you program that? You can program that to avoid an obstacle, but what happens in a situation when someone might be running in front of the road? Is the car going to make a decision like a human? Is it going to decide to save the driver or the person? These are, important questions, I suppose. Because the complexity of some of these questions is so great, I don't think that they often won't be able to be answered by a single discipline or an individual researcher. You're talking about the individual before. I think we're going to need collaborative, multifaceted ways of thinking and solving problems and unpacking situations, because they're complex. These kinds of questions are complex.